Welcome back to the Deep Dive. For anyone following the, well, incredibly difficult situation in Ukraine, trying to understand not just the conflict as it unfolds, but what any kind of resolution could possibly look like, this deep dive is for you.
Yeah, it's a huge question.
It really is. We're
Yeah.
tackling one of the most complex and, frankly, heartbreaking questions facing the world right now. In a conflict as devastating as this, what could a theoretical peace actually entail?
How do you even start?
Exactly. How do you even begin to draw a map for the future when the present is so challenging and the gap between the warring sides feels, well, impossibly wide?
That's precisely the mission for our deep dive today. We've pulled together a stack of sources, a lot of material that dissects a hypothetical, comprehensive Ukraine-Russia peace framework.
Okay.
And this isn't about predicting it or when peace happens, right? It's about taking the specific proposed framework as it's presented in the material and really digging into its intricate layers.
Getting into the nitty-gritty.
Totally. What would such an agreement have to cover? The sources analyze everything from, redrawing lines on maps, figuring out who pays for the colossal cost of rebuilding.
Which is astronomical.
Oh, absolutely. Sorting out credible security arrangements and attempting to address the historical factors that make conflicts so recurrent, trying to prevent history from tragically repeating itself.
Right. So our goal here is to unpack the core components of this specific framework as they are laid out and analyzed in the material you've shared. We want to explore the immense challenges each presents, understand the historical and legal context the sources provide, and ultimately, based on this analysis, get a sense of what the viability of such a complex arrangement might actually be.
Yeah, how likely is this kind of thing?
Exactly. We're diving into the specifics from these sources to give you, our listeners, a clearer picture of this potential path to peace as it's analyzed in the material. Okay, so let's set the stage first, because you really can't talk about peace without understanding the current reality on the ground.
Absolutely crucial. The sources describe the military situation as of June 2025 as one defined by intensity and a really protracted war of attrition.
So no quick wins for either side.
Pretty much, rather than seeing dramatic, sweeping territorial shifts, it's more of a grinding conflict. Both sides are constantly testing defenses, seeking incremental gains. It's tough.
And we see reports, reflected in the sources, of Russian forces maintaining that offensive pressure. They're noted in areas like northern Sumy Oblast, pushing near places like Andriivka and Yablonivka.
That's right. And critically, significant pressure continues in eastern Ukraine, particularly east of Pokrovsk, north of Velika Novosilka, and north of Kupiansk.
And the analysis in the sources suggests a strategic goal there, maybe establishing these buffer zones near the border.
Yeah, that's the interpretation. While Russia frames it as protection for its own territory, the sources point out this also serves to, consolidate control over the Ukrainian land they've taken.
Makes sense. Meanwhile, Ukraine isn't just sitting back.
Not at all. They're conducting their own counter-operations, naturally. But a key strategic adaptation highlighted in the material is their increasing reliance on quite sophisticated asymmetric tactics.
Meaning?
Well, specifically, the use of long-range drone attacks reaching deep inside Russian territory. This isn't just about, hitting random targets.
No, there's a strategy.
Exactly. The sources analyze this as a calculated strategic move. It's designed to degrade Russia's military and, importantly, its economic capacity and impose costs far from the conventional front lines.
A way to level the playing field a bit, given Russia's size.
It's a creative adaptation, definitely, to counter Russia's conventional military superiority.
That strategic chess match with asymmetric tools is, fascinating to follow. But despite these localized movements and these innovative tactics, the material suggests a crucial point, right? Neither side seems poised for a swift, decisive military victory anytime soon.
That's the assessment. It looks like a very costly stalemate, just grinding on.
Which brings us to the territory itself, the significant amount currently under Russian occupation.
Yeah, this is stark. As of late May, early June 2025, the sources estimate Russia occupies approximately 20% of Ukraine's internationally recognized territory. Some sources say 19–20%, but it's around that figure.
And that's not just landmass.
No, absolutely not. Its territory affecting an estimated 3 to 3.5 million Ukrainians living under these occupation conditions, their lives completely upended.
This is a staggering number of people.
It truly is. And this occupied territory, it includes Crimea, which was illegally annexed by Russia back in 2014,
Right.
and substantial portions of 4 mainland oblasts following the 2022 full-scale invasion. The sources estimate roughly 70% of Donetsk, nearly all of Luhansk, 99%,
Wow.
about 74% of Zaporizhzhia, and around 76% of Kherson oblasts are under Russian control.
So the total area occupied since February 2022.
It's about 27,604 square miles, which works out to roughly 12% of Ukraine's total land area. Significant chunk.
But it's not just simple lines on a map, is it? The sources make an important point about the cities within these regions.
Yes, that's crucial. Ukraine retains control over significant cities within these partially occupied oblasts. So cities like Kherson city itself and Zaporizhzhia city remain under Ukrainian authority.
Okay.
Plus others like Kramatorsk, Kostiantynivka, and Slovyansk in Donetsk Oblast. These cities had a combined pre-war population of over 1.3 million people.
So that really complicates any discussion about territory. It's not a clean split.
Far from it. The fact that Ukraine holds these key urban centers within regions Russia partly controls makes any territorial settlement incredibly difficult. These aren't just cities, they are strategic and, importantly, symbolic strongholds of Ukrainian identity and resistance.
And behind all these military lines and occupied maps is the human reality, the devastating humanitarian crisis. The sources paint a really stark picture here.
Devastating is the word used consistently. Nearly 39,000 civilian casualties were verified by October 2024. This includes over 12,000 deaths. And what's particularly striking, according to the sources, is that more than half of these casualties occurred far from the actual front lines. We're talking over 10 kilometers away.
Which points to?
It points to the impact of long-range strikes, missiles, drones, and potentially the systematic targeting of areas beyond the immediate combat zone. It shows how the war affects the entire country, not just the front.
Exactly. And the displacement?
Equally staggering. 83% of internally displaced people, IDPs, have been displaced for over a year. This isn't temporary.
No.
It indicates the protracted nature of this crisis and shows how few people have actually been able to safely return home.
And the impact on children?
Deeply concerning. Over 2,400 children killed or injured. An estimated 1.5 million are at risk of severe psychological issues, like PTSD. The sources report widespread mental health challenges. 63% of Ukrainian households reporting distress due to the uncertainty, the trauma.
And the physical destruction is just immense.
Catastrophic is the word used. There's been systematic targeting of civilian infrastructure, energy systems, essential services. This was particularly brutal during what the sources describe as the harshest ever winter season.
Trying to break morale.
Seems likely. And we can't forget the dire conditions reported for about 1 million people in the Russian-occupied territories, where humanitarian access for aid organizations is severely limited or non-existent.
This just creates a picture of overwhelming need, which leads directly into the next point. The astronomical cost of reconstruction.
The scale of destruction is truly unprecedented in recent European history. The latest assessment, based on data up to December 31st, 2024, estimates the total cost for reconstruction and recovery over the next decade at $524 billion USD.
Yeah, 524 billion euros.
Yep. That's about 506 billion euros. And to put that into perspective, it's nearly triple Ukraine's expected total economic output for 2024.
Wow. Just staggering.
And this figure actually represents a 7% increase from the estimate the previous year, which tells you the destruction is ongoing as the conflict continues. The bill just keeps getting bigger.
So how does that break down? Where are the biggest costs?
Well, direct physical damage alone is estimated at $176 billion, or $170 billion. Housing is the largest single need, requiring an estimated $84 billion. About 13% of Ukraine's entire housing stock is damaged or destroyed.
13%. That's huge.
It is. Transportation needs are around $78 billion. Energy and mining facilities need almost $68 billion for repair and rebuilding. And the sources specifically highlight a 70% increase in damage just to energy infrastructure, clearly a primary target.
Right. What else?
Commerce and industry are estimated at over $64 billion, and agriculture needs $55 billion, even just clearing the debris.
Must be a massive job itself.
It is. Almost $13 billion is needed just for debris clearance and management before rebuilding can even fully begin.
And these figures don't even cover everything.
Critically, no. They exclude needs that have already been met through aid and initial recovery efforts, which account for over $13 billion. So the total requirement is even higher than that $524 billion estimate.
And the immediate needs.
For 2024 alone, Ukraine required $37 billion in external budgetary support just to keep basic state functions operating. Meanwhile, their own national budget allocates nearly $40 billion to defense, about half their total spending.
Which leaves a massive gap.
A substantial gap for everything else: healthcare, education, pensions, you name it. Urgent reconstruction needs just for 2024 were estimated at $15 billion. So the financial challenge inherent in any peace framework is immense and immediate.
That sets an incredibly challenging stage for any discussion about peace. The military reality, the occupation, the human suffering, the cost. These are the concrete problems any framework has to somehow address. Okay, let's dive into the first core component analyzed in the sources: territorial concessions. Actually drawing the lines of a potential peace.
This is, well, arguably the most fundamental and difficult challenge for any potential settlement, according to the analysis in the sources. The hypothetical framework requires a clear delineation of which territories Russia would forfeit, meaning withdraw from, versus which, if any, it might retain control over.
Which is immediately complicated by the fighting.
Incredibly complicated by the fluid front lines and the ongoing military operations we just discussed. And it immediately runs headfirst into fundamental international law.
Right. The principle of not acquiring territory by force.
Exactly. Modern international law is exceptionally clear on this point. It explicitly prohibits the acquisition of territory through the use of force. This is a bedrock principle enshrined in Article 2.4 of the UN Charter.
And other principles, too.
Yes, things like the inviolability of frontiers, which is a key part of the Helsinki Final Act from 1975, and the non-recognition of territory acquired by force. These are cornerstones of the international order built after World War II.
And the sources are clear about Ukraine's legal standing here.
Unequivocally, Ukraine possesses clear legal rights to its internationally recognized borders as of 1991, when it gained independence after the Soviet Union collapsed.
So the Russian annexations.
The annexation of Crimea in 2014 and the subsequent attempted annexations of the mainland oblasts in 2022, following what the sources rightly call sham referenda. They are explicitly illegal under international law, full stop.
But history doesn't always follow the legal script, does it? What do the sources say about historical precedents for territorial adjustments after major conflicts?
They look into this, and it's complex. Historically, territorial changes that happen because of conflict are often formalized in subsequent peace agreements rather than just being reversed.
Like after World War II.
Exactly. The sources point to the remapping of Eastern Europe after World War II as a significant example. The analysis suggests there are limited precedents for large-scale territorial restitution following military occupation unless the occupying power has suffered a complete and decisive military defeat.
So getting land back without winning outright is historically rare.
Very rare. They mention the Treaty of Versailles, where Germany returned Alsace-Lorraine to France, but that was after Germany's total defeat in World War I. So the historical context makes the idea of Russia voluntarily giving back significant occupied territory without being decisively defeated seem, well, incredibly challenging to achieve based on past patterns.
That underscores the huge hurdle here. And what about the current stated positions of Russia and Ukraine on territory?
The sources highlight what they call an absolute contradiction on these core issues, particularly Crimea and the regions Russia tried to annex in 2022. Russia's stance, even in a hypothetical June 2025 memo discussed in the material, remains uncompromising. It demands recognition of the annexed territories as part of Russia.
Which is diametrically opposed to Ukraine's position.
Completely. Ukraine's consistent position, articulated clearly in President Zelensky's 10-point peace formula and numerous other official statements, firmly reaffirms the goal of restoring Ukraine's 1991 borders, all of its territory.
And there's a legal bloc within Ukraine, too.
Yes, and this is critical. The sources emphasize this. Ukrainian constitutional provisions explicitly prohibit territorial concessions. It's not just a negotiating stance, it's embedded in their fundamental legal framework and national identity. Any government agreeing to concessions could face a constitutional crisis.
Which brings us directly to the political feasibility and public opinion in Ukraine. The sources say this is a massive factor for any deal sticking.
Absolutely critical. The domestic political feasibility of making territorial concessions in Ukraine is described as exceedingly low. There's profound national trauma from the invasion, the years of conflict, the loss of life.
Understandable.
This has forged a very strong and broad public consensus against ceding any land to the aggressor.
And we've seen polls reflecting this.
Yes, the sources cite recent polling data, potentially from May-June 2025, showing remarkably high rejection rates. Figures like 67% of Ukrainians rejecting ceding any territory are mentioned, and this opposition is even stronger among younger Ukrainians, maybe around 80%.
So the political risk for any Ukrainian leader is immense.
The analysis in the sources is blunt. Any Ukrainian government that agrees to significant territorial concessions would face a severe crisis of legitimacy. This could easily trigger internal political unrest, potentially violent unrest, and completely undermine the stability and acceptance of the peace agreement itself.
So the deal has to be acceptable to the Ukrainian people.
Fundamentally, the sources emphasize that the stickiness or longevity of any settlement depends fundamentally on whether it has genuine Ukrainian public acceptance, not just signatures on a piece of paper.
And there's that deep-seated fear, rooted in history, that accepting losses would just legitimize Russia's aggression and invite future attacks down the road.
That historical experience, especially the failure of previous security assurances related to Ukraine's borders like Budapest, deeply fuels that fear and hardens the public stance against concessions. So, when the sources assess the overall viability of this hypothetical framework, they identify this territorial component
Getting Russia to give back land.
as having one of the lowest probabilities of actually being achievable. Russia's current military position and territorial control make those kind of unprecedented concessions seem very unlikely under present conditions, according to this analysis.
Okay. Component 1, drawing the lines of peace monumental hurdles. Clashes with international law, history, and the core positions and public opinion on both sides. Almost seems like a non-starter right now, based on this analysis.
It's certainly presented as the most intractable piece of the puzzle.
Okay, let's move to component 2, reparations and reconstruction. The immense cost and the critical question, who pays?
Right. As we highlighted, the scale of destruction is unprecedented. Reconstruction costs estimated at that staggering $524 billion over the next decade. The hypothetical framework analyzed in the sources proposes that Russia pays 15% of the total reconstruction costs.
15%. Okay, 15% of $524 billion. Doing the math, that's roughly $78.6 billion.
Correct. Now, from the Ukrainian perspective, according to the sources, reparations are seen as absolutely essential.
Not just about the money.
Not just about the practical need for funding reconstruction, although that's huge. It's framed as a fundamental issue of justice and accountability for the devastation, the loss of life, the suffering that Russia's aggression has caused.
And Ukraine has a clear demand.
Their official position is consistent. They demand Russian reparations, and critically, they're pushing for these payments to come specifically from frozen Russian assets held in Western jurisdictions. The sources also note that victims of the war themselves have strong demands for justice and reparations.
What about Russia's view on paying up? Does their hypothetical memo even entertain the idea?
It does the exact opposite. Russia's June 2025 memo, as referenced in the sources, includes a clause proposing a mutual refusal of claims for war-related damages.
So basically nobody owes anybody anything.
That's their stated position, in essence. Agreeing to pay reparations, especially on the scale of nearly $80 billion, would be seen internally in Russia as a profound acknowledgement of wrongdoing and responsibility for the war. That would have significant internal political ramifications for the current leadership.
So, again, directly opposing positions. Is there a solid legal basis for reparations in international law to back Ukraine's demand?
Yes, absolutely. There is a strong basis. The principle of state responsibility dictates that a state responsible for internationally wrongful acts and aggression, violations of the laws of war are definitely wrongful acts, is obligated to make full reparation for the injury caused.
Are there specific laws or treaties?
Well, the Hague Convention of 1907, for example, established principles related to compensation for damages during war. And historical precedents do exist. Think about reparations after World War I, or the various forms of reparations and restitution after World War II.
How did those work?
The methods varied widely. Some were based on assessed damages, some on the defeated state's capacity to pay, others were purely political deals. It included direct payments, in-kind transfers, asset seizures, even historically forced labor. So there's a history, but it's complex.
Okay, so the legal basis is there, history exists. But what about the practical challenges of actually enforcing these payments, especially that proposed 15% figure?
Major challenges here, according to the sources. First, while $78.6 billion is a massive amount, it actually falls significantly short of the full compensation that international law principles typically require for the assessed damages of over $524 billion.
So 15% isn't even close to the full amount legally required.
Potentially not. The sources describe the 15% as potentially initial and partial, suggesting it might not even be the intended final figure, which just adds more complexity. But the biggest challenge is practical enforcement without Russia's consent.
How do you make them pay if they don't want to?
Exactly. Historical examples like the UN Compensation Commission, the UNCC, which handled claims after Iraq invaded Kuwait that worked partly because Iraq's oil revenues, its main income source, were put under international oversight through the Oil for Food program. Reparations were paid from those funds.
Could that work with Russia?
Achieving similar comprehensive control over Russian exports like oil and gas seems politically very, very challenging in the current global environment. And the practical feasibility of the Russian state just making direct budget payments from Moscow is highly questionable, given its economy is under sanctions and its political unwillingness to admit responsibility.
So if direct payments are unlikely, how could this proposed 15% realistically be paid? Where would the money come from?
This is where the idea of leveraging frozen Russian sovereign assets comes in, and the sources view this as potentially a more viable pathway.
The $300 billion or so frozen in the West.
Approximately, yes. About $300 billion in Russian sovereign assets, mostly central bank reserves, are frozen in Western jurisdictions due to sanctions. Ukraine is demanding these assets be used for reparations, or at least remain frozen until reparations are somehow paid.
So the idea is that $78.6 billion, the 15%, wouldn't come from Russia's annual budget, but maybe as an initial payment source from these frozen funds.
Precisely. It kind of bypasses the need for direct voluntary payments from Moscow, which seems politically improbable right now. Now, the sources do note that the legal basis for outright seizing these sovereign assets for reparations is still a matter of active international debate. It's legally contested things like state immunity versus countermeasures for wrongful acts.
Breaky legal ground.
Very. But it is being actively explored internationally. The sources also suggest that making sanctions relief on Russia conditional on fulfilling reparations could provide significant leverage, though that's also complex to implement and monitor effectively.
What about monitoring how any reparations money is used? The outline mentions a four-party model: USA, Russia, China. Does that seem workable?
The sources analyze this proposed structure and raise some pretty critical questions. The potential for conflicts of interest is, well, obvious. Having Russia, the state obligated to pay, involved in monitoring its own compliance, seems counterintuitive.
Yeah, a bit like the fox guarding the henhouse.
Something like that. There's also a high risk of deadlock within that monitoring body because of geopolitical alignments. Imagine the EU-US trying to agree with Russia and China on contentious issues. The analysis suggests this structure would likely need significant changes to ensure real transparency, accountability, and impartiality in managing and dispersing reconstruction funds.
What about involving civil society NGOs, watchdogs, in monitoring?
That's discussed, and it has historical value in post-conflict settings. Civil society participation can add a valuable layer of oversight. However, the sources note that for this to be effective, it needs real political backing, technical and financial resources, and clear mandates. It's generally seen as a helpful addition to, but not a replacement for, robust and independent state-level monitoring.
Okay, so reparations. Legally grounded, desperately needed, but enforcement is tough. Russia opposes it. The 15% is partial and likely relies on the tricky path of frozen assets, and the monitoring setup looks problematic.
That's a good summary of the analysis presented on this component, another area with immense hurdles.
Let's move to component 3, security guarantees. This is huge, central to Russia's stated grievances, and involves looking beyond NATO membership for Ukraine.
Absolutely. Ukraine's aspiration to join NATO is actually written into its constitution since 2018. This has been a staunch red line for Russia, which is falsely framed Ukraine's potential NATO membership as some kind of existential security threat to justify its aggression.
Even though Ukraine has the right to choose its alliances.
Exactly. The sources note this framing directly contradicts Ukraine's sovereign right to choose its own security alliances, a principle recognized in the Helsinki Final Act. Meanwhile, NATO's official position remains that Ukraine will become a member eventually.
So the hypothetical peace framework analyzed here makes a pretty big assumption that Ukraine would agree to forego NATO membership.
Correct. In exchange for that fundamental concession, the framework assumes Ukraine would receive alternative security guarantees from a coalition of supporting nations, specifically mentioned as EU nations and the USA.
Which immediately raises the billion-dollar question. What would those guarantees look like? And would they actually be credible enough to stop future attacks?
That's the core issue. The sources examine several historical precedents for non-NATO security guarantees to see what we can learn.
Like what?
Well, one model is political assurances, like a memorandum. The prime example is the Budapest Memorandum from 1994. Ukraine gave up its huge Soviet nuclear arsenal in exchange for security assurances from Russia, the US, and the UK.
And how did that work out?
The sources are blunt. It failed. Decisively. It didn't stop aggression in 2014, and it completely failed in 2022. It wasn't legally binding, had no automatic enforcement, and depended entirely on the political will of the guarantors, especially Russia. It's described as having low applicability and being unlikely to be seen as credible by Ukraine precisely because it failed so badly.
So relying on another piece of paper like Budapest is probably a non-starter.
That's the strong implication. They also look at bilateral defense treaties, like the ones the U.S. has with allies like Japan, South Korea, or Israel, sometimes called major non-NATO ally status.
Well, those are different.
These are typically legally binding, often ratified by legislatures. They involve specific, detailed commitments, military aid, training, intelligence sharing, sometimes mutual defense clauses. They're generally effective where applied, but their success is very context-specific and requires strong, sustained political will from the guarantors to actually uphold their commitments, possibly even putting their own forces at risk.
What about security linked to joining the EU?
Yes, they discuss the EU Mutual Defense Clause, Article 42 of the Treaty on European Union. This is a legal commitment among EU members. If one is attacked, the others must provide aid and assistance by all means in their power. If Ukraine joined the EU, this would theoretically apply. But it's an untested clause in a major conventional war against a big power. It lacks NATO's integrated military command and pre-committed forces. Its real effectiveness depends heavily on the willingness and capabilities of individual EU members when a crisis hits.
The sources also mention an Israeli model. What's that?
Yeah, this idea is explored. It's less about formal treaties and more about building Ukraine into a state with a highly advanced, technologically superior self-defense capability. This would need massive, sustained Western support, huge financing, sophisticated tech transfer, deep intelligence cooperation.
Like Israel defends itself.
Kind of. It works for Israel in its context. But doing this for Ukraine would require maybe even greater long-term support, and Ukraine lacks Israel's unique strategic situation, like, for instance, potential implicit nuclear deterrence.
What about armed neutrality, Switzerland style?
Another model examined. A state declares neutrality, doesn't join alliances, but builds a very strong national military to deter attackers, maybe with outside suppliers. Switzerland, Sweden before NATO are examples. Its effectiveness depends on the neighborhood and the state's own strength. Could Ukraine deter Russia alone this way, even well-armed? The sources raise that question. It would require huge investment.
And finally, collective security outside NATO, like a coalition of the willing.
These are more ad hoc or maybe formal agreements among a group of states for mutual assistance. They're flexible, can mobilize resources, but they often lack the institutional backing, pre-assigned forces, and command structures of NATO. This raises credibility questions. Will everyone really commit when push comes to shove? The risk of free riding.
So looking at all these non-NATO options, what's the main takeaway from the sources?
They highlight what they call a profound credibility crisis surrounding non-NATO guarantees specifically for Ukraine. Because of the history, especially the failure of Budapest, there's deep skepticism about relying on anything less than a formal binding defense commitment.
So for any alternative guarantees to work, to be acceptable to Ukraine and actually deter Russia, they have to be fundamentally different, built stronger.
Absolutely. The sources emphasize several must-haves. They must be legally binding, not just political promises. They must be exceptionally specific, detailing the aid, intel, triggers for action. And they need robust, predefined enforcement mechanisms.
Like?
Maybe pre-positioning military gear in Ukraine, Mechanisms for automatic rapid response and consultation among guarantors, not getting bogged down in debates during a crisis. The analysis stresses they must explicitly avoid the mistakes that doomed past assurances.
What about Ukraine's ongoing path to the EU? The sources mentioned enhanced EU consideration and integration. How does that fit in?
This is presented as a really significant, though different kind of geopolitical and security anchor for Ukraine. It's not a military alliance, but it's deeply impactful. Ukraine is actively pursuing full EU membership. Accession negotiations officially opened June 25, 2024.
Which requires huge internal reforms in Ukraine, right?
Yeah. Yes. Massive reforms are needed. Constitutional court, judiciary, anti-corruption, de-oligarchization, media freedom, minority rights, a long list. But the process of EU integration itself is seen as a powerful driver of positive change inside Ukraine, firmly aligning it with Western structures, legal, economic, political.
And even if the EU isn't NATO.
Right. Even though it's not a military alliance like NATO, membership significantly raises the political and economic costs for Russia of any future aggression. Attacking an EU member state is a much bigger deal internationally than attacking a non-member.
And Russia has historically been less fiercely opposed to Ukraine joining the EU compared to NATO.
The sources note that distinction. The EU's own strategy, like the May 2025 Black Sea strategy mentioned, underlines its long-term commitment to Ukraine's resilience, security, reconstruction, and its EU path. They see it as a crucial strategic investment in European stability. Accelerating Ukraine's EU path based on merit and reforms is viewed as providing a powerful long-term security and economic anchor. But, the sources stress, this needs clear benchmarks and sustained, strong EU support for those reforms.
Okay, so in this hypothetical framework, with NATO off the table, the security piece relies on crafting genuinely credible alternative guarantees, learning from Budapest's failure, and leveraging the long-term security and stability benefits of accelerated EU integration.
That's the essence of it. And the credibility and enforceability of those guarantees are absolutely paramount.
Let's turn to component 4, economic agreements. Leveraging Ukraine's resources and innovation potential for recovery. Ukraine has significant natural wealth, doesn't it?
It does. Substantial mineral resources, including critical raw materials, CRMs, which are increasingly vital for modern tech, green energy, defense industries.
Like what specifically?
The sources mention significant deposits of lithium, maybe 500,000 tons, possibly a third of European reserves. Also, Ukraine has about 20% of global graphite deposits and roughly 7% of Europe's titanium supply.
Key stuff for EV batteries, aerospace, high-tech manufacturing.
Exactly. The sources mention a specific U.S.-Ukraine minerals agreement signed around April or May 2025. The analysis notes this agreement grants U.S. firms 50% revenue shares in joint ventures form to extract these resources, while, and this is important, Ukraine explicitly retains ownership of the subsoil.
Okay, because the initial query mentioned something about exclusive rights, but the sources describe a partnership model.
That's an important distinction, yes. The source analysis of the actual signed deal describes a partnership, a joint venture with revenue sharing, not exclusive rights solely for U.S. firms. Plus, the EU has its own strategic partnership on raw materials with Ukraine from 2021, aiming to integrate supply chains and develop the sector. So it suggests a multilateral approach involving both the U.S. and EU is already happening.
So any agreements like this need careful structuring to ensure Ukraine benefits significantly.
Absolutely. The sources stress the need for transparent tenders, fair competition, equitable production sharing terms, and explicitly prioritizing Ukrainian national benefit. That means environmental protection, promoting local development where extraction happens. This is particularly critical, the sources note, given Ukraine's wartime vulnerability, which could create an imbalance in bargaining power when making these deals.
How about structuring the revenue? The outline mentioned maybe directing funds to specific sectors like education or defense.
The sources discuss this possibility, how resource revenues could be managed. For instance, that U.S.-Ukraine deal specifically directs 50% of future revenues from new royalties from these JVs towards reconstruction efforts. And it requires investments from profits to be made within Ukraine, reinvesting profits for 10 years.
So that deal focuses on broader reconstruction.
Correct. Not just education defense specifically in that case, but the concept of dedicating resource revenues to national priorities like those is explored.
Are there historical models for managing resource wealth like this? Examples?
Yes. The sources mention things like sovereign wealth funds, where resource money is saved or invested for the future, think Norway, or the Alaska Permanent Fund. India's district mineral foundations are also mentioned for directing revenue to local development. Implementing this effectively in Ukraine would need robust governance, transparency like EIT principles, strong accountability to prevent corruption, and careful alignment with national development goals. It's a balance, immediate needs versus long-term benefit.
What about technology transfer? Both military and civilian tech.
Sources cover both. Regarding weapons tech, Ukraine's domestic defense industry has grown significantly, especially in drones and electronic warfare, learning from intense combat experience. There's active discussion and some early examples of joint ventures with European defense firms combining Ukraine's battlefield innovation with Western tech and investment.
They're trying to boost domestic production.
Definitely. The sources mention a Ukrainian government resolution from March 2025 allowing the transfer of state military tech documents to companies, including private ones, specifically to boost production.
And consumer tech.
That's more broadly about supporting Ukraine's economic modernization and integration into global value chains. Things like the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement involve gradually adopting EU technical standards, helping modernize the economy and integrate with European markets.
For both types of tech transfer, what's the key goal or challenge the sources highlight?
They emphasize aiming beyond just simple sales or licensing. It should foster genuine co-development, build local production capabilities within Ukraine, especially vital for defense independence, and contribute to broader industrial modernization. The critical challenge is ensuring these partnerships build real capacity and long-term benefit for Ukraine, avoiding new dependencies on outside tech providers.
Are there historical parallels?
Complex ones. The Marshall Plan required open markets. The 1965 Japan-Korea Normalization Treaty included tech transfers. These show partnerships can work but need careful design.
So, Ukraine has potential in resources and innovation, but realizing it faces hurdles like the ongoing conflict, occupation, infrastructure damage. Economic deals need careful structuring for transparency, national benefit, and avoiding new dependencies.
That's the nuanced picture from the sources. Large-scale revenue from resources hinges on stable peace, reconstruction, and attracting significant upfront investment.
Let's move to Component 5, non-interference in governance. Protecting Ukraine's sovereignty, which the sources say is deeply rooted in its history.
Yes, described as having deep roots in its historical experience, creating profound and lingering apprehensions about outside manipulation. This isn't just recent history.
Goes way back.
Way back. The sources highlight the Soviet-era legacy. Centuries of centralized control from Moscow, systematic suppression of Ukrainian identity, mentioning the Holodomor, the man-made famine in the 30s, as a deliberate act to crush identity Russification policy, subordination of Ukrainian governance.
And this interference didn't stop when the Soviet Union collapsed.
Not at all. Sources point extensively to post-Soviet Russian interference. Overt influence campaigns, like backing Yanukovych in the 2004 Orange Revolution. Framing democratic movements like the 2014 Euromaidan as foreign coups to justify intervention and annexation.
A consistent pattern.
A consistent, multifaceted effort by Russia to install pro-Russian leaders in Kyiv, undermine Ukraine's pro-Western path, erode sovereignty through pressure, coercion, disinformation, cyber attacks, and ultimately military aggression and occupation. In occupied areas now, sources note active suppression of Ukrainian language culture, forced passportization, indoctrination.
So Ukraine's demand for non-interference isn't abstract. It's a direct response to a real, painful, ongoing history. What's the international legal basis for this principle?
It's considered a bedrock principle of international law. Non-intervention in internal-external affairs is in Article 207 of the UN Charter. And elaborated in the 1970 UN Declaration on Friendly Relations, no state can intervene directly or indirectly for any reason. The Helsinki Final Act of 1975 also reaffirms this duty to refrain from interference.
Given that history, any formal commitments in a peace deal would need to be incredibly specific and enforceable, I imagine.
Absolutely. Sources strongly emphasize that simple promises won't cut it. Commitments need to be specific, backed by concrete, enforceable safeguards, not just prohibiting military coercion.
What else?
Explicitly prohibiting things like election interference, secret funding of political parties or media, disinformation campaigns, cyber attacks on critical infrastructure or political processes, using energy or trade as political weapons.
How could you possibly enforce those kinds of prohibitions in practice?
Sources suggest drawing on templates for enforcing international norms, maybe establishing investigation capabilities to identify and document interference, potentially criminalizing certain interference activities, using targeted sanctions against those responsible. But Sources note this needs huge institutional capacity in Ukraine and, crucially, sustained political will from international partners enforcing the deal.
What about international monitoring?
Assurances could include monitoring missions, real-time reporting of suspected interference, maybe even automatic sanctions triggers for verified interference. But effectiveness depends on the capability and willingness of guarantors to actually investigate and impose consequences.
An independent international commission was mentioned.
Yes, proposed as a potential mechanism. Linked to security guarantors, but crucially, sources say Russia should be excluded from it. This commission would monitor compliance, investigate breaches, recommend countermeasures. This structure addresses the conflict of interest issues seen with the proposed reparations monitoring body.
How do you balance legitimate international support?
Yeah.
Ukraine will need massive help rebuilding with preventing that support from becoming a new form of interference. It's a fine line.
That's a key challenge highlighted. Carefully distinguishing legitimate support, technical assistance, financial aid, capacity building from inappropriate political manipulation or control mechanisms that undermine sovereignty. The framework and its implementation must protect Ukraine's democratic processes while enabling necessary cooperation.
And what specific things could Ukraine do internally to protect its sovereignty?
Sources discuss several layers: strengthening constitutional protections against foreign interference in elections decision-making, empowering independent oversight bodies, maybe mixed domestic international, transparency requirements for all international aid and cooperation deals, strengthening judicial independence and rule of law, key targets for interference, and finally, protecting and supporting Ukrainian civil society, media freedom, NGOs, human rights groups as vital watchdogs building national resilience.
So protecting sovereignty in a peace deal isn't just principle. It's about building specific, enforceable defenses against that historical pattern of interference, ensuring peace allows Ukraine to be truly sovereign going forward.
Exactly. Creating the conditions and mechanisms for a future free from the patterns of the past.
Okay, we've dissected the proposed components: territory, reparations, security, economy, non-interference. Now, let's bring in the international actors mentioned and look at the overall viability and challenges of this specific framework. First, Russia's central role and leverage.
Russia is the aggressor state. Its agreement is fundamentally necessary for any peace deal. As of June 2025, it occupies about 20% of Ukraine, continues offensive operations, has a larger military extensive defense capacity.
And their negotiating stance remains tough.
Highly uncompromising, according to the sources, described as demanding Ukrainian capitulation. Recognize annexed territories, permanent neutrality or demilitarization, denazification, which sources interpret as regime change in Kyiv for a pro-Moscow government. Russia offers no significant concessions, portrays Ukraine's government as illegitimate.
What's Russia's leverage to push these demands?
Primarily its continued military presence and its stated willingness and capacity to prolong the war, imposing immense costs on Ukraine and its supporters. Energy politics still plays a role globally, though less so in Europe. And its nuclear rhetoric, while condemned, remains a background factor influencing international risk assessment.
And Russia's core goal?
As analyzed in the sources, formalize its territorial gains, secure a subservient or constrained Ukraine in its sphere of influence, ensure Ukraine can't pursue independent pro-Western policies, especially NATO. Sources state Russia's definition of peace isn't mutual respect, but formalizing its gains.
And the likelihood of the current Russian leadership accepting terms like giving back territory or paying big reparations seems low.
Extremely unlikely under present conditions, based on the analysis. Accepting such terms would have profound negative internal political ramifications for the current leadership. Sources suggest this only becomes feasible with the decisive Russian military defeat far beyond the current grind or maybe a severe internal crisis in Russia.
What about China's role?
Yeah.
Complex and ambiguous, often described that way.
Very much so. Officially, China supports talks, advocates a political settlement, has its own position papers emphasizing sovereign territorial integrity, though often without condemning Russia's violation of these in Ukraine.
But China has deepened its partnership with Russia during the war.
Yes, a key factor. China provides Russia an economic lifeline against Western sanctions, offers diplomatic cover. This deepening relationship makes China one of the few powers with potential significant leverage over Moscow, mainly due to Russia's increasing economic dependence on China.
Could China play a constructive role in a settlement or implementation?
Sources suggest China might be interested in a post-war role, maybe peacekeeping, maybe reconstruction investment. Some analysts think engaging China could pressure Putin, given Russia's reliance. If China invests heavily in Ukraine's reconstruction, it gains a stake in stability there, potentially leading it to discourage future Russian destabilization that harms its investments.
And its proposed role monitoring reparations.
Delicate point. China's neutrality is often seen in the West and Ukraine as pro-Russian. Involving China in monitoring Russian reparations would likely face skepticism unless China clearly demonstrated impartiality. Otherwise, it could be seen as providing cover for Russia, not real oversight.
But China actively participating in a European peace settlement would be a big geopolitical shift.
It would. An expanded Chinese footprint in Eastern Europe, especially via investment, would be major. The U.S., in particular, would likely view this with concern, potentially adding new tensions to the U.S.-China competition.
What about other international actors? UN, regional powers.
They could play roles in specific implementation aspects, monitoring, humanitarian access, reconstruction coordination. But sources stress these roles need careful design, clear mandates, coordination to avoid conflicts or bureaucracy undermining things.
Okay, taking all these components, the huge challenges, the actors' roles and leverages into account, what's the overall assessment from the sources on the viability of successfully negotiating and implementing this specific hypothetical framework right now?
Based on their detailed analysis, the sources estimate the overall probability of successfully negotiating and implementing this specific framework is approximately 35–40%.
That's not very high.
It reflects the significant hurdles. Sources see higher feasibility for some parts, like maybe some economic cooperation, but that's balanced against the extremely low probability assigned to core elements like territorial concessions and getting comprehensive reparations that depend on Russian consent, especially given Russia's current military position.
So the biggest roadblocks are exactly where the framework clashes most fundamentally with Russia's demands and position.
Exactly. The analysis also points to other factors, reducing prospects for this specific framework, now potential divisions among Ukraine's Western supporters, strong domestic political opposition in Ukraine to necessary concessions, especially on territory.
Can you summarize the major obstacles identified?
Key barriers highlighted. The political concessions needed, especially territory, are immense challenges for both sides, clashing with core positions and domestic politics. Enforcing reparations and non-interference without consent or credible consequences is highly challenging. The credibility of non-NATO security guarantees is deeply questioned due to past failures. And potential geopolitical competition among guarantors monitors, US-EU versus Russia-China, could easily undermine implementation.
Given this sobering assessment of this specific framework, do the sources offer suggestions on how it could be modified to be more viable or better protect Ukrainian interest if talks ever happened?
Yes, they do. Based on their analysis, they provide specific suggestions for modifications aimed at strengthening the framework for Ukraine and potentially increasing long-term sustainability, even while acknowledging the huge current difficulties.
Okay, let's hear those recommendations. How could it be improved?
On territory, sources recommend any framework explicitly define forfeiture as full Russian withdrawal to 1991 borders. If phased, tie it strictly to verifiable actions and international monitoring. Unequivocally, no legitimacy for territorial acquisition by force.
Reaffirming that core legal principle. Got it.
On reparations, state the 15% figure clearly as initial partial. Establish an independent international commission explicitly excluding Russia to assess full damages and determine total reparations. Crucially, prioritize using frozen Russian sovereign assets as the primary source, and restructure any monitoring body to exclude Russia for impartiality.
Using those frozen assets seems key to making reparations work, based on their analysis.
According to the sources, yes, it's the most viable funding mechanism discussed. On security guarantees, explicitly refute the false narrative that NATO caused the war. Guarantees must be legally binding, maybe bilateral treaties, not just memos. Exceptionally specific on aid intel triggers for action. Backed by robustly enforced, potentially automatic mechanisms for rapid response. And strongly recommend accelerating Ukraine's merit-based EU accession path as a strategic anchor.
A clear break from the failed Budapest model.
That's the explicit recommendation. On economic deals, affirm Ukrainian state ownership of resources. Deals based on transparent tenders, equitable terms prioritizing Ukrainian benefit, fair revenue share control. Genuine partnerships, not exclusive rights. Technology transfer must build Ukrainian capacity, especially defense, avoiding new dependencies.
Building capacity, not just reliance. It makes sense.
On non-interference, clauses must be highly specific, prohibiting all forms of coercion, cyber disinformation, economic pressure. Reiterate importance of an independent international commission, excluding Russia, for monitoring, with predefined countermeasures for breaches.
Giving those non-interference commitments real teeth.
Exactly. The overarching recommendations prioritize upholding international law and Ukrainian sovereignty, robust, verifiable security guarantees, comprehensive, just reparations using frozen assets, phased implementation with verification, economic reconstruction benefiting Ukraine as a peace dividend, leveraging EU integration, addressing Russian concerns only outside Ukrainian sovereignty, sustained international unity pressure, including Ukrainian civil society.
It sounds like the sources, while finding this framework highly challenging as presented, offer a clear path for modifications, a path that would make any potential deal more equitable, enforceable, and aligned with international law and Ukrainian interests, precisely because they pinpointed the huge shortcomings. It's like a blueprint for what a more just and more sustainable peace would need to look like from Ukraine's perspective.
That's exactly the core contribution of their analysis or recommendations. They highlight the gap between this hypothetical framework and what a durable, just peace likely requires, and offer concrete ways to bridge that gap if a political opening ever emerges.
Okay, we've taken a really deep dive into this hypothetical peace framework for Ukraine. We've examined its proposed elements in detail, explored the significant challenges, analyzed the complex web of law, history, geopolitics, influencing its viability, all through the lens of the sources you provided.
And it's abundantly clear from the sources, simply outlining components isn't enough. The devil is truly in the details: enforceability of reparations, credibility of security guarantees after past failures, protecting sovereignty against historical interference, ensuring economic deals genuinely build Ukraine's strength.
And this deep dive lays bare that fundamental tension. The urgent, desperate need to end the conflict, stop the suffering, halt the destruction, versus the imperative for any resolution to be truly just, sustainable, respect international law and sovereignty, and actually deter future aggression, not legitimize conquest.
Yeah, a huge dilemma.
The sources give us a sober, data-driven assessment of the viability of this specific deal now, and importantly, offer concrete suggestions for how it could be restructured to better serve Ukrainian interests, while still remaining, maybe theoretically, a basis for future negotiation if the political landscape shifts.
It's a challenging picture. It illustrates the immense chasm between what's legally and morally right, what Ukraine and its supporters want, and what might currently be politically or militarily achievable given Russia's maximalist position.
So, as you reflect on this detailed analysis, consider the core challenge highlighted by the sources, especially for those of you trying to understand the real politic here. How do you structure a peace agreement when one party's stated goals, like annexing territory by force, fundamentally contradict international law, and where history shows enforcing complex peace deals against an unwilling major power is, well, mixed at best? Does achieving any peace in such a context necessarily require compromises on fundamental principles? And if so, what are the potential long-term costs of those compromises, not just for Ukraine, but for the future stability of international order? It's a question the sources grapple with directly, and one that demands careful, difficult thought.
A question without an easy answer, that's for sure. Reinforces the immense complexity of finding a path out of this devastating conflict.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into a potential path to peace in Ukraine. We hope it's given you valuable insight into the complexities and challenges involved based on the analysis and the material provided. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into the information shaping our world.